October 4, 1944. 10,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka pressed his gloved hand against the canopy of his Mitsubishi A6M50, squinting into the afternoon sun. His oxygen mask hung loose around his neck, a habit born from hours of low-altitude patrol work, where such precautions seemed unnecessarily formal. Below, the water stretched endlessly, interrupted only by the distant silhouettes of American invasion ships clustered near Leyte Gulf. The battle raging across the Philippine archipelago had drawn every available aircraft from Japanese carriers and land bases. Tanaka's squadron had been launched barely 90 minutes earlier, with orders to intercept incoming American strike formations. 9 other Zeros flew in loose formation around him, each pilot scanning the sky with the hypervigilance of men who understood that complacency in the Pacific skies meant death. Tanaka was 26 years old, with 400 hours of total flight time. He was considered moderately experienced, which meant he would likely survive his current tour of duty. Many pilots younger than him had not. The Nakajima Sakai engine of his fighter hummed with its characteristic rhythm, a sound he had learned to trust through dozens of combat missions across the Philippines and over Formosa. The Zero had never let him down. That trust, earned through 2 years of Pacific air combat, was about to be tested in ways Hiroshi Tanaka could not possibly anticipate. The radar operators below radioed a contact report. American aircraft approaching from the southeast, altitude unknown, distance estimated at 60 miles. Tanaka acknowledged the transmission and checked his instruments with practiced precision. Fuel gauge showing adequate reserves, oxygen regulator functioning normally, gun sight warmed to operating temperature. The 2 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns would respond instantly to his trigger finger. Everything was exactly as it should be. He began a gentle turn toward the reported bearing. At that precise moment, 90 miles away and 18,000 feet above, a formation of 12 Grumman F6F Hellcats banked northwestward, their pilots' eyes fixed on the radar-vectored intercept course. The Hellcats flew in a 3x4 formation, 4 divisions of 3 aircraft each, positioned with the sun behind them, the oldest advantage in aerial combat, invisible attackers backed by blinding light. Leading the formation was Commander James Forsyth, a lean, dark-haired pilot from Connecticut with 16 confirmed kills. Beside him flew his wingman, Ensign Robert Chen, a 22-year-old whose hands barely reached the rudder pedals without the addition of cushions. Behind them and slightly below flew the other 10 Hellcats, each pilot scanning the empty sky ahead, each one running through the mental checklist that had become second nature. Forsyth keyed his radio. "All right, Scimitar Flight. Let's not be careless today. These are going to be good ones. Stay in formation, watch your wingman, and do not, repeat, do not engage in turning fights if you can avoid it. We have the advantage. We keep the advantage by using our speed." The Hellcats descended gradually, dropping altitude to intercept the Japanese formation at optimized energy state. 5,000 feet per minute descent rate, maintaining forward speed, building potential energy for the attack to come. This was textbook F6F doctrine, refined through 8 months of combat experience and informed by detailed intelligence gathered from a single captured Zero now sitting in a California hangar, having been dissected and studied by American engineers and test pilots. Back at 10,000 feet in his Zero, Hiroshi Tanaka's eyes caught movement, high, above the formation, against the westering sun. He squinted, trying to focus through the glare. Just sun reflection, probably, or clouds catching the light. But something in peripheral vision insisted there was more to see. His hand moved instinctively to increase the oxygen flow. His breathing deepened. The years of training, all those doctrine lectures about detecting early warning signs, began firing in his consciousness. He was about to key his radio to alert the flight leader when the first burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire raked across the right wing of the Zero, flying to his immediate left, Lieutenant Masaru Hideo's aircraft. 24 years old, married, with a daughter he had never seen, a pilot Tanaka had flown alongside for 3 months. The burst of 6 bullets, moving faster than sound, punched through the thin aluminum skin of the Zero's wing before Hideo even registered what was happening. His aircraft shuddered violently. In that fraction of a second before catastrophic structural failure, Hideo saw the tracers arcing past his canopy. 6 glowing lines of ammunition converging from above and behind. His mind had perhaps half a second to recognize the shape of the attacking aircraft, larger than a Zero, different profile, not a Wildcat, not a Corsair, something new. Then the airframe began to come apart. The wings separated cleanly at the root, wrenched away by forces the aluminum structure could not withstand. The Zero flipped inverted, spun downward in a flat rotation, and began the long tumble toward the Philippine Sea far below. Hideo ejected from the tumbling wreckage, his parachute opening with a billowing white cloud that would be visible for miles. By the time his parachute was fully deployed, he was already thinking about the rescue submarine that might or might not reach him before American escort vessels did. Hiroshi Tanaka watched his wingman's destruction unfold in what seemed like slow motion but actually lasted less than 3 seconds. That mental window was expanding now. The clock was counting. 90 seconds from the first burst of enemy fire to the moment Japanese Zero tactics would either succeed or fail catastrophically against this new American fighter. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Zero formation was already breaking apart in the reflex panic of attacked aircraft. 2 fighters in the rear of the formation broke downward, following the doctrine of generations of Japanese pilots facing superior altitude. If you are lower and fighting an opponent above you, you turn. You exploit the Zero's legendary maneuverability. You force your enemy into a turning fight where your advantages dominate. Get slow, get turning, force your opponent to match your turn, and victory follows. But these pilots did not understand yet what they were facing. The F6F Hellcats, 6 of them peeling away from the main formation, did not follow the breaking Zeros downward. Instead, they dove after the retreating aircraft, using their superior power and energy state to maintain closure. The Hellcats were faster even in the dive. The Packard Merlin engines, producing 2,000 horsepower each at combat power, could sustain acceleration that the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine, with its more modest 1,100 horsepower, could never match. The 2 Zeros broke hard left in a desperate climbing turn, attempting to gain the vertical advantage that had served them so well against earlier American fighters. But the Hellcats simply turned with them, their hydraulically boosted ailerons responding instantly to stick inputs. There were no frozen controls at high speed, no fabric-covered surfaces ballooning with air pressure, no mechanical limits to control response. The Hellcats had been designed specifically to avoid the weaknesses that American test pilots had discovered in the captured Zero. Commander Forsyth, closing rapidly on the trailing Zero, slowed his approach rate to preserve ammunition. Precision over speed. A 3-second burst at optimal range was infinitely more efficient than extended bursts at extreme distance. The distance closed. 800 yards, 600, 400. The Zero's silhouette grew larger in his gun sight. At 250 yards, Forsyth squeezed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns, each loaded with 500 rounds, each firing at a rate of 750 rounds per minute. In the fraction of a second of trigger pressure, approximately 3,000 rounds of ammunition left the barrels. Not all of them impacted the target. Perhaps 20% of bullets fired in actual combat connected with the target. But the Zero's wing surface area made it a relatively simple target from this range. The burst struck the Zero's fuselage, slicing through the thin aluminum skin as if it were canvas. Rounds punched through the oil cooling system. Rounds shattered the glycol lines running from engine to radiator. Rounds struck the airframe in cascading impacts. The Zero's engine, suddenly starved of cooling fluid, began to overheat catastrophically. Smoke, then flame, began pouring from the cowling. The pilot, First Petty Officer Takeshi Yamamoto, saw the temperature gauges racing into the red, oil pressure dropping, coolant temperature climbing past survivable limits. He jettisoned the canopy and prepared to bail out. But at 16,000 feet and in a shallow dive, exiting the aircraft was not a simple matter. The wind force at this speed was tremendous. He attempted to roll the Zero inverted to let gravity assist his exit. The aircraft responded to the control input, but the frame, already weakened by machine gun damage, could not withstand the structural stress. The fuselage fractured. The Zero came apart into fragments of aluminum and composites, tumbling through the sky. Yamamoto, pulled free by the disintegrating airframe, fell through 200 feet of debris before his parachute opened. If he survived the water landing, if the sharks stayed away, if friendly forces retrieved him before American escort ships did, he might see Japan again. Hiroshi Tanaka, still at 12,000 feet, and watching the destruction of his flight unfolding at speeds his training had never contemplated, felt something shift in his consciousness. Time seemed to compress and expand simultaneously. The 60-second mark had passed. 30 seconds remained. His remaining 7 aircraft had scattered in all directions in the panic of sudden attack. The coordinated formation that had given them mutual protection was now a liability. 7 individual Zeros against 12 Hellcats, whose pilots had trained specifically to exploit exactly this moment. Tanaka pushed his Zero into a steep climbing turn to the left, the maneuver that had served Japanese pilots through years of Pacific combat. The Hellcat that had been pursuing another Zero broke away from that engagement and turned toward Tanaka's climbing form. The Hellcat pilot, Lieutenant David Bray, executed the exact opposite of what Tanaka expected. Instead of climbing to follow the Zero's lead, Bray pushed the stick forward and dove away, trading altitude for energy and speed. For an instant, Tanaka thought he had achieved the impossible. The American was fleeing. His superior maneuverability would allow him to chase the fleeing Hellcat, to force it into a stern chase where Japanese climbing ability and turning performance would dominate. Tanaka pushed his throttle to war emergency power, an extreme setting that drained engine life with each passing second but delivered maximum performance. The Zero climbed after the diving, fleeing Hellcat, but the Hellcat was not truly fleeing. David Bray was executing what American pilots called a boom and zoom attack, the fundamental tactic derived from studying the captured Zero and understanding its critical weakness at high speed. Bray allowed the Hellcat to accelerate in the dive, climbing his speed to 450 miles per hour. At this velocity, the Zero's ailerons would be nearly useless. The fabric covering the control surfaces would balloon from air pressure, requiring enormous stick force to achieve even modest control response. At the bottom of the dive, 5,000 feet below the Zero, Bray began a gentle pull-out. The Hellcat's robust airframe and powerful engine could sustain the maneuver without fear of structural failure. American aircraft had been designed to withstand G-forces that would break a Zero apart. Bray's Hellcat pulled up smoothly, climbing back toward Tanaka's position. The time window was closing. 70 seconds had elapsed since that first burst of enemy fire claimed Hideo's aircraft. 20 seconds remained before the psychological moment of realization would crystallize into tactical defeat. Hiroshi Tanaka, turning hard in his climb, suddenly understood something that his training had never adequately prepared him for. The American fighter was faster. It could accelerate away when you pursued. It could dive to speed and turn back to engage at altitude where the Zero's maneuverability meant nothing. You could not force the American into the turning fights that were your domain. The American could choose when and how to engage. The American dictated the terms. This was not how air combat had worked in 1942 when Tanaka was first learning to fly. This was not the scenario his instructors had described. This was a fundamental violation of the assumptions underlying Japanese fighter tactics. Bray closed rapidly from below and behind, his Hellcat accelerating into the thin air of altitude where the Zero's performance had always been marginally superior. But the Hellcat was not subject to the same limitations. Its supercharged engine, pressurized to maintain power at altitude, continued delivering full military power even at 17,000 feet, where the Zero's engine was beginning to gasp for air. Tanaka saw the Hellcat approaching from below, and for the first time in his flying career, he experienced something beyond the familiar calculus of tactical engagement. He experienced genuine fear, not the healthy vigilance of combat awareness, but the existential dread of realizing that everything he had trusted, every technique he had mastered, every assumption underlying his training, was obsolete. The distance between the aircraft closed. 300 yards, 250, 200. At 150 yards, David Bray opened fire with 650 caliber machine guns, each one delivering a continuous stream of armor-piercing ammunition. The bullets converged on Tanaka's Zero like a deadly swarm, moving at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The impact was simultaneous across the fuselage. Tanaka's aircraft shuddered as the rounds struck home. Something fundamental in the aircraft's structure fractured. The control stick in his hands went slack, the hydraulic connection severed by the machine gun fire. He had perhaps 2 seconds of awareness before the Zero's structure began to fail. He reached for the canopy jettison handle and yanked hard. The canopy blew away into the slipstream. Tanaka unstrapped from his seat and attempted to exit, but the Zero was already beginning its final tumble. The centrifugal force of the spin pinned him to the seat. He was trapped in a machine that was coming apart around him. The 90-second window had closed. The engagement that had seemed to contain infinite possibility had compressed into a few seconds of violent, irreversible change. From his escorting wingman's perspective, the entire engagement lasted approximately 2 minutes. 7 Japanese aircraft had been scattered by the initial diving attack. 5 of them were now destroyed or burning or falling with dead or dying pilots. 2 had managed to escape into the clouds below. The remaining Japanese formation had been completely eliminated as a cohesive fighting unit. The Hellcats had suffered no losses. One F6F carried a bullet hole through its vertical stabilizer. Another had a round that grazed the wing root. Negligible damage. The pilots compared notes on the radio as they climbed back to altitude to rejoin the main formation. Forsyth's voice came through the headsets with the calm professional tone of a man who had just orchestrated a perfect tactical execution. All Scimitar flight, check in by number. The 12 Hellcats radioed their status. Scimitar 1 through 12, all present and accounted for. No casualties, fuel reserves adequate, ready for secondary patrol assignment or return to base. Forsyth acknowledged and set course back toward the Combat Air Patrol Station. The engagement was over. By any measure, it had been a complete tactical success. 7 Japanese fighters engaged, 5 destroyed, 2 escaped, no American losses. The exchange ratio was acceptable. No, it was more than acceptable. It was becoming routine. This was the new reality of the Pacific War in October 1944. American fighters with overwhelming technical superiority were steadily grinding down the remaining Japanese air forces through attrition that Japan could not replace. Back on the aircraft carriers and at land bases across the Philippine archipelago, the message that would shape the final months of the Pacific War was becoming clear to anyone observing the combat reports. The Zeros that had dominated the early war were no longer capable of competing with American fighters. The Hellcats, equipped with superior engines, better armor protection, hydraulic controls that remained responsive at high speeds, and tactics informed by detailed knowledge of the Zero's weaknesses, were sweeping Japanese pilots from the sky with mechanical efficiency. But the real story of those 90 seconds from the first burst of machine gun fire through Hiroshi Tanaka's final moments was not simply about technical superiority. It was about the psychological collision between expectation and reality. For 2 years, Japanese pilots had operated under the assumption that their aircraft, their training, and their fighting spirit were adequate to the demands of Pacific air combat. That assumption had been validated through victories and attrition that had seemed like acceptable costs for dominance. By 1944, that assumption was collapsing in real time. Every combat mission that new Japanese pilots flew confronted them with evidence that their aircraft were obsolete. Their engines could not match Hellcat performance. Their control systems could not respond at high speed. Their fuel capacity could not extend endurance for prolonged patrol. Their pilots, increasingly undertrained due to fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors, could not match American tactical sophistication. Most painfully, their fighting spirit, once the psychological advantage that seemed to overcome material disadvantage, now meant nothing against an enemy that simply flew away from turning engagements, used superior speed and altitude to control engagement timing, and possessed armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks that meant a few burst hits would not ignite catastrophic fires. In those 90 seconds of aerial combat, Hiroshi Tanaka had lived through the compressed version of what Japan as a nation was experiencing across the entire Pacific, a period when previous certainties were giving way to inescapable reality, a moment when technological advantage, industrial capacity, and tactical innovation combined to create a gap that courage and determination could not overcome. The story of the F6F Hellcat and the Mitsubishi Zero in 1944 was fundamentally a story about that gap. Not the gap in performance specifications, though that was significant. The gap in what each fighter represented about its nation's capacity to wage modern industrial war. The Zero in 1944 was a refined version of a 1940 design. The basic airframe, the fundamental design philosophy, the underlying assumptions about how fighters should be built had not significantly changed. Improvements had been made, certainly. More powerful engines, additional armor, improved armament. But these were incremental modifications to a design whose basic character remained unchanged from its revolutionary debut at Pearl Harbor. The Hellcat, by contrast, represented a synthesis of everything American designers had learned from 3 years of combat experience. It incorporated intelligence from the captured Zero about what weaknesses to avoid. It embodied tactical lessons about high-speed control authority and the importance of armor protection. It reflected the philosophy that American fighters should be built strong enough to survive and sustain damage, fast enough to control engagements through superior speed, and powerful enough to outclimb and outrun every competitor. The industrial capacity to produce these aircraft in quantities that ensured numerical superiority was almost secondary to the fundamental design difference. Yes, America could produce 12,000 Hellcats, but even if production had been limited to half that number, the F-6F's technical excellence would have ensured dominance against the Zero. The combination of design superiority and numerical superiority, however, created a situation where Japanese air power faced not just tactical defeat, but systematic destruction. In those 90 seconds of combat over the Philippine Sea, with Hiroshi Tanaka's life ending in the wreckage of his Zero, the larger truth of the Pacific War's final phase was being written. Japanese aviation, which had once been the dominant force driving American naval forces back across the ocean, was becoming a managed casualty of American superiority. Every engagement like this one, every pilot lost, every aircraft destroyed, represented Japan's dwindling capacity to defend itself. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was perhaps as significant as the tactical reality. When pilots who managed to escape reported back to their squadron commanders what they had witnessed, American fighters that could not be outturned, that could not be outrun at high speed, that responded to control inputs at speeds where Japanese controls froze up. The message was clear. The comfortable doctrines that had served Japanese pilots since 1940 were no longer viable. The world had changed while Japanese air forces were still fighting the previous war, and if the tactical foundation of Japanese air combat had become obsolete, what did that suggest about the broader strategic situation? If Zeros, the aircraft that symbolized Japanese technological capability and fighting spirit, could no longer compete with American fighters, what hope remained for defending the home islands from the advancing American offensive? These were the questions that emerged from conversations between pilots in ready rooms across the Pacific. These were the doubts that began to erode confidence in victory. The 90 seconds of aerial combat that ended with Hiroshi Tanaka's death were therefore more than a single tactical engagement. They were a microcosm of the Pacific War's denouement, a moment when technical superiority, industrial capacity, and refined tactical doctrine combined to create an outcome that seemed foreordained the moment the engagement began. The F-6F Hellcat had transformed American naval aviation from a service struggling against a superior opponent to one that dictated the terms of air combat, absolutely. This transformation had not happened overnight. It was the product of months of combat experience, thousands of pilot hours, hundreds of aircraft lost and lessons learned from each loss, continuous refinement of tactics, and most critically, the intelligence advantage provided by the captured Zero. That single aircraft, sitting in a hangar in San Diego and tested by Eddie Sanders and other American pilots, had revealed the weaknesses that made the Hellcat's dominance possible. From the captured Zero, American pilots learned that high-speed control authority was critical. The Hellcat's hydraulic systems provided it. From the captured Zero, they learned that pilot protection and self-sealing fuel tanks were valuable. The Hellcat provided them. From the captured Zero, they learned the specific maneuvers that exploited Japanese aircraft limitations. The Hellcat was designed to execute these maneuvers effectively. Every element of Hellcat design and employment was in some way informed by the single fact of understanding what the Zero's weaknesses were. Hiroshi Tanaka, climbing hard in his final moments before the Hellcat's guns found him, knew none of this. He knew only that the American aircraft behaved in ways his training had never contemplated. He knew only that his aircraft's legendary maneuverability meant nothing when the American pilot refused to engage in turning combat. He knew only that his engine was struggling in the thin air at altitude where the American engine continued delivering full power. He knew only, in the final moment of awareness, that something fundamental had changed. That realization, that moment of understanding that everything he had been taught was incomplete or wrong, was the true meaning of the 90 seconds. Not the literal passage of time, but the psychological window between certainty and doubt, between confidence and fear, between the assumed inevitability of Japanese air superiority and the inescapable reality of American technological dominance. The Hellcat made that realization manifest in the most visceral possible way, through the simple, brutal fact of superior firepower, superior speed, superior design, and superior tactics, converging to create an outcome that left no room for doubt or exception. In those 90 seconds, a generation of Japanese pilots' understanding of air combat evolved, or was violently terminated, before evolution could occur. In the months that followed October 1944, this pattern repeated thousands of times. Engagements that lasted minutes but conveyed truths about national capability that would take years to fully comprehend. Every Japanese pilot who survived to encounter the Hellcat and lived to report back carried this knowledge. Every pilot lost carried the unspoken testimony of that knowledge into the grave. By the time Japan surrendered in September 1945, the message had been written in the sky from Tokyo to the Philippines, in the wreckage of 1,000 Zero aircraft and the loss of thousands of Japanese pilots. The Hellcat had not just defeated the Zero. It had redefined what was possible in the air. It had proven that American design, American manufacturing, American tactics, and American pilots could not simply match Japanese aviation, but could overwhelm it so completely that the outcome of any engagement seemed predetermined before guns were fired. That was the real victory of those 90 seconds, not the tactical destruction of a single Zero formation, but the strategic revelation that American air power had achieved an ascendancy from which there was no recovery. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The transformation of naval aviation from the early war period, when American pilots often returned from combat shaken by encounters with Zeros, to the later war period, when the situation had completely reversed, was one of the most dramatic shifts in military capability in World War II. That shift was built on multiple foundations. Superior industrial capacity allowed America to replace losses while Japan could not. Tactical intelligence provided by studying the captured Zero revealed specific weaknesses to be exploited. Design philosophy that prioritized both performance and survivability created a fighter that could sustain the punishment of combat while delivering overwhelming firepower. Training systems that prepared pilots for realistic combat conditions created airmen who understood not just how to fly, but how to fight. All of these elements converged in moments like Hiroshi Tanaka's final engagement. In 90 seconds or less, a Zero pilot would discover that the assumptions underlying his entire combat experience had become false. The aircraft that had been legendary would suddenly seem fragile. The maneuvers that had always worked would no longer be effective. The enemy would not cooperate with Japanese tactical doctrine, but would instead dictate engagement terms that favored American capabilities absolutely. This was not unique to Tanaka. It was the experience of thousands of Japanese pilots in 1944 and 1945. Some survived to internalize the lesson. Many did not. But for those who lived to reflect on these moments, the psychological impact was profound. They had encountered not just superior equipment, but proof that the entire framework of their training was obsolete. The brilliance of the Hellcat's design was that it had been created specifically to expose this obsolescence. Every system, every performance characteristic, every tactical application had been refined through intensive study of the captured Zero and understanding of what American pilots needed to achieve dominance. The result was an aircraft that seemed almost designed to be proof of concept for American technical and industrial superiority. In later decades, historians would debate the relative importance of various factors in achieving American victory in the Pacific. The submarine campaign that strangled Japanese logistics, the code-breaking that revealed enemy intentions, the island-hopping strategy that advanced American bases closer to Japan, the strategic bombing campaign that destroyed Japanese cities and industrial capacity, the atomic bombs that provided the final impetus towards surrender. All of these contributed meaningfully to the outcome. But for pilots like Hiroshi Tanaka, the answer was simpler and more immediate. We lost because they had better aircraft flown by better trained pilots, using better tactics, based on knowledge of our capabilities gained from studying one of our aircraft they managed to capture intact. That simple explanation contained the essential truth of the later Pacific Air War. One captured Zero in 1942 had led to the design refinements and tactical doctrines that made the Hellcat invincible by 1944. One aircraft preserved through chance and salvaged through effort had provided intelligence that allowed American designers to create a fighter optimized to defeat the aircraft that had for 3 years been the terror of the Pacific. The transformation from defensive inferiority to overwhelming superiority was traced directly to that single captured machine. The 90 seconds of combat that took Hiroshi Tanaka's life were thus connected by unbroken line of causation to an Aleutian bog in 1942, where another pilot, Tadayoshi Koga, had made a landing that sealed his fate and provided America with the key to air superiority. The Hellcat and the Zero were forever linked not as competitors, but as the before and after of a strategic transformation. The Zero represented Japanese capability at its peak. The Hellcat represented what emerged when America fully understood what it was fighting. In the Philippine Sea in 1944, that transformation was complete. Japanese pilots like Hiroshi Tanaka faced an enemy that could dictate engagement terms, sustain damage they could not, outperform their aircraft across almost every metric, and execute tactics derived from meticulous study of Japanese capabilities and limitations. In 90 seconds or less, a Zero pilot's entire combat worldview would shatter. The aircraft that had once been invincible would suddenly reveal itself as vulnerable and obsolete. The tragedy of those 90 seconds was not simply that individual pilots died. It was that those deaths represented the cumulative failure of a national strategy and industrial base that could not keep pace with an enemy that had learned to exploit their capabilities against them. The captured Zero had taught American designers not just how to build better aircraft, but how to build aircraft specifically optimized to defeat the aircraft that Japanese pilots were flying. That optimization, that precise targeting of design requirements to exploit known weaknesses, was perhaps the most important lesson the Hellcat embodied. It was not enough to build a generally superior aircraft. The Hellcat had been designed and refined to be superior in the specific ways that mattered against the Zero. Every design decision, from hydraulic control systems to armor protection to high-speed performance, had been made with explicit knowledge of what American pilots needed to defeat Japanese aircraft. This was modern warfare in its essence. Not the random clash of forces, but the precise application of intelligence, design, manufacturing capacity, and tactical doctrine focused like a laser on defeating a known opponent. The result was 90 seconds of air combat that encapsulated the entire trajectory of the Pacific War's evolution, from the early months of Japanese dominance to the final period of American overwhelming superiority. Hiroshi Tanaka's death was one among thousands in the Pacific Air War. His name was not recorded in American histories. His squadron was not famous. His final combat mission was not commemorated in official reports. But in those 90 seconds, in that moment when he understood that his aircraft, his training, and his tactics were all inadequate to the challenge before him, he lived through the compressed version of Japan's entire war experience. Initial capability, adaptation, survival, and finally, inescapable realization that the enemy possessed advantages that could not be overcome. The Hellcat had proven this across thousands of engagements, but in each instance, the fundamental truth remained the same. In the skies over the Pacific, American technical superiority, informed by intelligence gained from studying a single captured Zero, had created a situation where Japanese pilots, no matter how brave or skilled, were outmatched before combat began. The 90 seconds of combat were simply the time it took for this reality to become physically manifest in wreckage and casualty reports. The legacy of those 90 seconds rippled through the final months of the Pacific War. Every pilot who survived an encounter with the Hellcat carried the knowledge that the air war was lost. Every pilot who died in the attempt to resist carried unspoken testimony to the same truth. The Japanese aviation industry that had once been the proud producer of the revolutionary Zero found itself unable to respond to the challenge the Hellcat represented. By 1945, Japanese designers were struggling to create fighters that could even approach the Hellcat's performance, hampered by fuel shortages, material scarcity, and the reality that the technological gap had become too large to bridge. The Hellcat had won the air war not through a single great victory, but through the accumulation of hundreds of tactical successes, each one demonstrating the fundamental superiority of American design, manufacturing, and tactical sophistication. Hiroshi Tanaka was merely one of thousands of pilots who discovered this truth in the sky over the Pacific. That discovery, repeated thousands of times over, with each discovery ending in the death or defeat of Japanese pilots, had transformed the Pacific from a theater of Japanese dominance to one of American supremacy. The battle over the Philippine Sea in October 1944 was one of many engagements that defined the PERD, the final phase of the Pacific War. But it was representative of a fundamental shift in air combat dynamics that had begun months earlier and would only accelerate as the months progressed. By the time Hiroshi Tanaka's Zero fell from the sky, the pattern was already well established. American Hellcats were systematically destroying Japanese fighters at exchange ratios that reflected complete technological and tactical dominance. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. From June 1944 through August 1945, F6F Hellcats flying from American aircraft carriers and later from captured Japanese airfields claimed approximately 5,100 Japanese aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Against this extraordinary toll, American losses totaled approximately 270 Hellcats shot down by enemy action. The resulting kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1 represented not victory through superior tactics or courage, though both were present, but rather victory through the compression of every American advantage into a single fighter aircraft. That aircraft had been designed with explicit knowledge of what it needed to defeat. The captured Zero that sat in an American hangar, studied by Eddie Sanders and analyzed by intelligence officers, had become the template against which the Hellcat's capabilities were measured. High-speed control authority. Hydraulic systems that responded instantly at speeds where Japanese controls locked up. Armor protection that allowed pilots to survive hits that would ignite the Zero's unprotected fuel tanks. Engines that delivered full power at altitude where the Zero struggled. Every element of the Hellcat's design had been refined based on understanding of the Zero's weaknesses. The result was an aircraft that seemed almost engineered for the specific purpose of proving Japanese aviation obsolete. And, in practical terms, that is precisely what occurred over the 18 months following the Hellcat's combat debut in August 1943. The Japanese response to the Hellcat threat proved inadequate to the challenge. Designers attempted to create successor aircraft to the Zero that could compete with the Hellcat. The result was a series of aircraft that arrived too late, in insufficient quantities, and often with performance characteristics that did not significantly exceed the aircraft they were meant to replace. The Ki-84 Frank represented one such effort, a relatively advanced fighter with good performance at altitude, but production was limited, and by the time the Ki-84 reached operational squadrons in late 1944, American Hellcats were already so numerous, and their pilots so experienced, that the introduction of new Japanese aircraft types made minimal strategic difference. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, meanwhile, represented an attempt to improve upon the Zero's basic design through increased power and better performance. Yet the Oscar, while faster and more powerful than the Zero, still could not match the Hellcat's capabilities across the board. It retained the Zero's fundamental vulnerability to high-speed attacks and its insufficient armor protection. Against American pilots trained specifically in tactics that exploited these weaknesses, the Oscar proved no more survivable than the Zero it was meant to supplement. By 1945, Japanese aircraft production had become almost irrelevant compared to American production capacity. Grumman's factories alone produced over 12,000 Hellcats between 1942 and 1945. American aircraft production overall exceeded 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Japanese production, hampered by strategic bombing of aircraft factories, fuel shortages that limited training and operations, and the loss of experienced designers and engineers, had collapsed to a fraction of American output. The mathematics of attrition were thus overwhelmingly in America's favor. For every Japanese fighter destroyed, American factories produced 3 or 4 more to replace losses. For every Japanese pilot killed, American training centers graduated 10 more to take his place. The exchange ratio in combat, while dramatic and validating of American technical superiority, was secondary to the basic demographic and industrial reality that Japan simply could not sustain the losses involved in facing the Hellcat-equipped American Navy. The human cost of this disparity manifested most visibly in pilot mortality rates and training quality. By 1944, Japanese pilots entering combat were receiving less than 1 to 100 hours of flight training in many cases. American pilots, by contrast, received 3 to 100 to 6 to 100 hours of training before reaching combat zones. An American pilot who survived his first few missions could expect to rotate home after 100 to 150 combat missions. A Japanese pilot was expected to fly combat missions until killed or captured, with no rotation home under any circumstances. The result was an inexorable decline in Japanese pilot quality. The superbly trained pilots of Pearl Harbor and the early war were nearly all dead by 1944. Their replacements were hastily trained youngsters with minimal flight hours who were immediately thrust into combat against American pilots with hundreds of hours of experience. The Hellcat, forgiving in its handling and effective in the hands of even moderately trained pilots, was perfectly suited to this environment. American pilots could exploit the Hellcat's advantages systematically because they had been trained to do so. Japanese pilots, facing an aircraft superior in nearly every metric and using tactics they had never encountered, were sent to their deaths with regularity that approached systematic execution. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese pilots was consequently severe. As the months progressed through 1944 and into 1945, Japanese pilots developed what American intelligence officers termed Hellcat fatigue, or in some reports, Zero fatigue, a recognition that engaging F6F Hellcats in combat was statistically likely to result in death or capture. Reports from Japanese pilot debriefings and post-war interviews consistently reflected the same theme. The Hellcat was simply superior. When Japanese pilots attempted to force turning fights, American pilots simply dove away, using superior power and speed to escape. When Japanese pilots attempted to dogfight at altitude, American aircraft could fight at elevations where Japanese engines were struggling. When Japanese pilots attempted to absorb return fire and survive, American weapons fire pierced through their unprotected fuselages with devastating effect. The tactical wisdom that had sustained Japanese aviation for 4 years of war proved useless against the Hellcat. Everything pilots had learned about exploiting the Zero's maneuverability was irrelevant because American pilots refused to engage in turning fights. Everything they had learned about fighting at altitude was negated because the Hellcat could fight effectively at heights where the Zero was marginal. Everything they had learned about absorbing punishment and continuing to fight was contradicted by the reality that the Hellcat could take hits that would destroy a Zero and continue flying. By summer 1944, Some Japanese military planners began to recognize that air superiority over the Pacific had been irreversibly lost. The question was no longer whether American air power would achieve dominance, but rather how quickly that dominance could be consolidated, and what would be the best tactical response to the inevitable invasion of the home islands. Strategic considerations began to focus on preserving whatever aviation resources remained for the desperate defense of Japanese territory itself, rather than committing them to battles over distant island territories. This meant that the Hellcat's dominance increased almost exponentially as the war progressed into 1945. Japanese aircraft that had been husbanded in reserve for defense of the homeland meant fewer fighters available in the forward Pacific areas where American operations were proceeding. American Hellcats, increasingly unencumbered by significant enemy opposition, could focus on ground attack missions, strafing Japanese airfields and destroying aircraft on the ground, adding to the attrition that aerial combat was already inflicting. The result was a compression of the air war into its final phase, characterized not by dramatic aerial engagements, but by systematic destruction. Large formations of American Hellcats would sweep over Japanese territory, encountering minimal opposition because there was no longer sufficient Japanese air strength available to contest American operations. The few Japanese aircraft that did attempt to intercept were destroyed or driven away with minimal loss to American forces. By August 1945, Japanese aviation had been reduced to scattered remnants, many of them preserved for last-ditch kamikaze operations against American invasion fleets rather than committed to conventional air defense operations. The Hellcat's role in this systematic destruction cannot be overstated. Had the Zero or its successors retained even parity with American fighters, the campaign would have proceeded very differently. Contested airspace, even if ultimately controlled by America, would have exacted a much higher price in American casualties and consumed far more American resources. The Hellcat's overwhelming superiority meant that American air operations proceeded with minimal opposition, allowing the strategic bombing campaign to continue unimpeded, allowing invasion operations to proceed without air threat to invasion fleets, allowing American forces systematically dismantle Japanese defensive capabilities across the Pacific. One captured aircraft, studied in detail by American test pilots and engineers, had thus indirectly contributed to the destruction of thousands of Japanese aircraft and the deaths of tens of thousands of Japanese pilots. The Akutan Zero, preserved through chance in an Aleutian bog, had provided the intelligence template that guided the Hellcat's design refinements. From that single aircraft had emerged the detailed knowledge of what American pilots needed to defeat Japanese aviation comprehensively. Intelligence officers, aircraft designers, and commanders had taken that knowledge and synthesized it into doctrine, production priorities, and tactical training that systematically optimized American air power for the specific purpose of defeating Japanese aviation. The result was an operational environment where the outcome of air engagements was essentially predetermined by the technical and tactical advantages American forces possessed. Hiroshi Tanaka, climbing hard in his Zero somewhere over the Philippine archipelago, represented one data point in an enormous statistical reality. His death was one among thousands that occurred in similar fashion, under similar circumstances, with the same fundamental cause. Japanese pilot encounters with American Hellcats produced casualties in ratios that approached inevitability. The specific individuals who died and the specific locations where they died varied, but the outcome remained constant. The Hellcat had transformed Pacific air combat from an arena where Japanese skill and determination could overcome American material disadvantage into one where American technical superiority was so overwhelming that skill and determination were essentially irrelevant factors. The best Japanese pilot in the world, flying a Zero against an average American pilot flying a Hellcat, would lose that engagement unless the Japanese pilot had extraordinary altitude or positional advantage at the moment of contact. And even then, the American pilot could simply dive away and escape, regaining altitude for another attack. This complete reversal from the early war, when American pilots fled from Zeros, to the late war, when Japanese pilots fled from Hellcats, reflected the integration of design, intelligence, production, training, and tactical doctrine into an optimized system of air superiority. Every component of that system had developed through hard experience and specific learning from the captured Zero. The Hellcat pilots who achieved ace status and higher claims, pilots like David McCampbell who scored 34 victories, had done so not through exceptional talent, but through operating an aircraft of such superiority that consistent success against the enemy was almost guaranteed. McCampbell was an excellent pilot, certainly, but his extraordinary score reflected primarily the quality of the aircraft he flew and the tactical environment in which he operated. Placed in the cockpit of a Zero and facing American Hellcats, McCampbell would have faced the same mathematical improbability of survival that faced every other Japanese pilot. The asymmetry of this situation, where technological and tactical advantages were so overwhelmingly on one side, raises questions about the nature of modern warfare that remain relevant into the contemporary era. When one side possesses such complete technical superiority, when design, production, and tactical sophistication combine to create an environment where the outcome of engagements is essentially predetermined, what does that suggest about the future of conflict? The answer that emerged from the Pacific War was that it suggests the decisive importance of technological development, industrial capacity, and the integration of intelligence into design decisions. Nations that could gather intelligence about enemy capabilities and convert that intelligence into design specifications that exploited known weaknesses possessed enormous advantages. Nations that could produce weapons in quantities sufficient to sustain combat losses while inflicting unsustainable losses on enemies possessed advantages that courage and determination could not overcome. The Hellcat and the Zero, therefore, represented not just a competition between two aircraft designs, but between two national systems of warfare. American aviation reflected American industrial capacity, American design philosophy prioritizing both performance and survivability, American training systems that prepared pilots systematically for combat, American tactical doctrine informed by detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities. Japanese aviation, by contrast, reflected Japanese industrial capacity declining from external pressure. Japanese design philosophy prioritizing maneuverability and range at the expense of protection, Japanese training systems overwhelmed by casualty rates exceeding replacement capacity, Japanese tactical doctrine rendered obsolete by opponents who refused to fight according to expected rules. When these systems collided in the skies of the Pacific, the outcome was never in doubt. The only question was how long it would take for the full implications of American superiority to become apparent, and how many lives would be lost in the process of that realization. The answer, ultimately, was that it took approximately 2 years from the Hellcat's combat debut to achieve overwhelming air superiority, and it cost thousands of lives on both sides, with Japanese losses dramatically exceeding American losses in ratios that reflected the fundamental imbalance in capabilities. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By the time Japan surrendered in September 1945, the Hellcat had become something more than a fighter aircraft. It had become a symbol of American, technical and industrial supremacy, proof that American design philosophy and manufacturing capacity could overcome any challenge posed by enemy innovation. Every veteran who flew a Hellcat and survived to tell about it carried the understanding that they had flown one of the greatest weapons of the war. Every pilot they had shot down, every Zero they had seen destroyed, every engagement they had fought, had validated the superiority of their aircraft and the tactical doctrine that employed it. The psychological confidence this created was as important as the technical advantages the aircraft possessed. American pilots knew they were flying superior equipment. They knew that if they flew with discipline and executed their training, they would likely survive and their opponent would likely not. This knowledge created a decisive psychological advantage that complemented the technical advantages of the aircraft itself. Japanese pilots, facing the same reality from the opposite perspective, knew that their aircraft was inferior. They knew that their tactical doctrines had become obsolete. They knew that the only way to survive combat was through luck or the opponent's error, not through any advantage their own aircraft or training could provide. This knowledge created a corresponding psychological disadvantage that meant even pilots who possessed exceptional skill and courage were fighting with a mental burden that their American opponents did not carry. The combination of technical superiority, psychological confidence on the American side, and psychological demoralization on the Japanese side created a situation where air combat outcomes were determined before the first shot was fired. The Hellcat had achieved this not through any single revolutionary capability, but through the synthesis of multiple advantages integrated into a coherent system optimized for victory. The legacy of the Hellcat extends far beyond World War II. The principle that detailed knowledge of enemy capabilities can guide design specifications toward defeating that enemy has become a cornerstone of modern military procurement. Every modern weapons system incorporates intelligence about potential opponents into design requirements. Every military plans procurement and development with explicit consideration of what enemy capabilities need to be defeated. This approach, validated through the Hellcat's success against the Zero, has become the standard framework for military development across all services and all nations. The Hellcat proved that you do not need to be first or best at everything. You need to be best at the things that matter in actual combat against actual opponents, and you achieve that through careful intelligence about what those opponents actually threaten with and what capabilities matter most. The captured Zero made this possible. Without the detailed intelligence about the Zero's strengths and weaknesses, the Hellcat would still have been an excellent fighter, but it would not have been optimized for the specific purpose of defeating Japanese aviation. It would have been a good general-purpose fighter rather than a precision instrument engineered to exploit known weaknesses in the enemy's primary weapon. With the intelligence, the Hellcat became exactly what was needed at exactly the right moment. American aircraft designers could specify requirements for hydraulic control systems that would maintain responsiveness at high speed. They could specify requirements for armor protection that would allow pilots to survive hits that would destroy a Zero. They could specify engine power that would allow sustained performance at altitude where the Zero struggled. Every design decision could be traced to specific intelligence about what the Zero could and could not do. The result was an aircraft that seemed almost designed to prove the Zero obsolete, and in practice, that is precisely what occurred over the 18 months following the Hellcat's combat debut. An entire generation of Japanese pilots discovered that their aircraft, their training, and their tactics had become antiquated. Their response was often desperation, occasionally heroic sacrifice, but ultimately futile resistance to an enemy that possessed overwhelming technical and tactical advantage. Hiroshi Tanaka and thousands like him did not fail because they lacked courage or skill. They failed because they were flying an aircraft and executing tactics that had been designed in 1940 against an enemy operating an aircraft designed in 1943, with tactics refined through 18 months of combat experience against the original Japanese design. The 5-year development gap between Zero and Hellcat, combined with the fact that one had been designed with explicit knowledge of the other's capabilities, created an imbalance that human factors could not overcome. The final months of the Pacific War illustrated this conclusively. As American forces approached the home islands in 1945, Japanese aviation attempted one last defensive effort. The result was the systematic destruction of the remaining Japanese Air Force in engagements where the Hellcat and its sister aircraft achieved kill-to-loss ratios that approached mathematical inevitability. Nearly every engagement was an American victory. The rare cases where Japanese pilots achieved success were notable precisely because they were exceptions to the norm. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered, the air war had become almost irrelevant to the outcome of the broader conflict. American air superiority was so complete that the question was not whether American forces would control the skies, but rather how to manage the systematic destruction of Japanese aviation resources that remained. The Hellcat had achieved this dominance through superiority that made competition futile. The story of the Hellcat and the Zero is thus a story about more than just aircraft design and aerial combat tactics. It is a story about how nations wage war in the modern era. It is a story about the decisive importance of technological development, backed by industrial capacity and guided by intelligence about enemy capabilities. It is a story about the transformation that occurs when one side in a conflict achieves technical superiority so complete that the outcome of individual engagements is essentially predetermined. And at the heart of that story is a single aircraft captured in an Aleutian bog, studied in detail by American test pilots and engineers, and transformed into design specifications that guided the creation of a weapon system that would help determine the outcome of the Pacific War. From that single captured aircraft emerged the intelligence that informed the design of the Hellcat. From the Hellcat emerged the dominance of American naval aviation. And from that dominance emerged the defeat of Japanese aviation and the transformation of the Pacific War in the final 2 years of conflict. The 90 seconds of combat that took Hiroshi Tanaka's life were thus connected through multiple threads of causation to an island bog in 1942, where another pilot had crashed, to a test pilot in San Diego who had carefully analyzed the captured aircraft, to designers in Long Island who had incorporated the lessons learned into new specifications, to factory workers who had built thousands of aircraft according to those specifications, to training programs that had prepared pilots in tactics derived from the captured Zero's weaknesses. Every element of this system worked in concert to create an outcome that was overwhelming in its totality. The Hellcat was not just a superior aircraft, it represented the full integration of intelligence, design, production, training, and tactical doctrine into an optimized system of air warfare. Against such a system, the Zero and its pilots, excellent as they were for their time, could not compete. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.